Welcome, everybody, to episode 11 of the Never Board of Trade podcast. It's been 11 episodes already. I don't know how we did it, but folks are listening, and we appreciate that. And on that note, I want to thank our sponsor, the Brampton Honey Badgers, and we'll hear more about them in a moment. But J. Paul, my co-host for this podcast, he is not available today. He's actually out in the wilderness. In a man versus wild situation. He's probably fashioned a spear out of a repurposed piece of wood or something like that. So we wish him well, but in his stead, we have a very special guest, someone who is not unfamiliar to our socials, certainly not unfamiliar to our Policy and Government Relations Committee, and we will probably speak about this a little bit. But we are working together on what will be, I think, a pretty transformative report on public transit in Brampton and in the region. I want to welcome to the podcast Mr. Jonathan English.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And I've wanted to speak to you on this podcast for some time and just have a discussion about transit. I mean, a lot of, I think, what we'll talk about, we're sort of preempting the white paper that we're working on. You've talked, you've written actually in a few different articles about, what Brampton's getting right and all of these things. These are all things I want to touch on. But I thought we could talk a little bit. We can start off just with you reintroducing yourself to the audience, and we can go from there.
So yeah, I'm Jonathan, and I live here in Brampton, so it's near and dear to my heart. I do care about it, and I'm also somebody that's been engaged in sort of infrastructure questions and other policy issues for a long time.
Yeah.
I did a PhD in urban planning where I looked at places that have been successful in getting people to use transit in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And
where did you do your PhD, by the way?
At Columbia in New York.
Excellent. Yeah.
And I actually have a book coming out at some point, based on these ideas. And one of the places that has been super successful, which we can talk about later, is that's right. It is Brampton. In over the last 15 or so years, there's been amazing success there. And in terms of my experience, I used to be the policy director focused on this stuff at the Toronto Region Board of Trade.
Right.
So I know the Board of Trade world well.
Yes.
And would collaborate with the Brampton Board of Trade when I was there.
I do want to talk a little bit about your Toronto, your TR bot experience. Backing up to the PhD for a moment. First off, how did you get into the world of transportation and urban planning and all of that? What piqued your interest?
So I guess the truth is I've always been super interested in it. As far back as I can remember. Mm-hmm. And for me, I've just always been really interested in networks and how things work and the kind of underlying, the infrastructure that helps us to live. Yeah. This has always been something super interesting to me. I've lived in a bunch of different places around the world. And when I do, I like to figure out, where do they get their electricity? Where do they get their water? It's interesting to me because these are things that we rely on so completely. Yeah. And yet they're basically, by design, mostly invisible.
Yeah.
And so, that always interested me. I actually started out in grad school in the kind of Cold War history world.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in that as well. But what I discovered was, this was in the States, the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project was this big project in the 1970s to fix up the railway line between Boston and Washington through New York and Philadelphia. And this was a huge project. It was a huge deal in the 70s. Like, it was front page of the New York Times. Like, the president at the time was actively engaged in it, et cetera. But there was nothing written on it in the academic literature. Like, there was just no journal articles, nothing like that. And I thought, this is, I don't know, when you're in an academic world, that's kind of what you look for, something that people haven't written 500 things about already. And I thought, this is actually something that we need to to dig into a little bit more and understand better. And that project in particular was one that didn't go so well.
Oh, okay.
So, they had pretty high hopes when they started this project. And by the end, they had spent a lot more than they expected and got a lot less than they expected.
Okay.
And so I tried to write about why that was and what went
Okay,
wrong,
okay.
and why other places at the same time. So France at the same time built the Paris to Lyon high-speed train.
Yes.
Which if you've been to Paris or been to France, it's super busy. It's super fast. It's transformative. They actually ended up spending less on that than the Americans spent on this project that kind of failed at the same time.
Okay.
So, I was very interested in why that was, and what happened and what went wrong.
Yeah.
I could.
Yeah, I'm Cole's notes. Why was it much cheaper?
Well, I think there were a few different reasons.
Yeah.
One is it's easier to build new sometimes than to fix old.
Right.
So that's part of it. But a lot of it was just experience, right? So France had been building. They didn't build brand new rail lines or high speed, but they've been electrifying. They've been adding tracks. They've been improving their trains since the Second World War. Like they've been doing these projects, and the railway in France was by the 70s huge. I mean, it stayed huge. And so they had this deep bench of engineering and other expertise that really knew what they were doing. In the States, there had not been a significant intercity rail project since the 30s. Electrification of that line, I guess, arguably even earlier.
Okay.
And so anyone who had worked on these projects in the 30s, by the 70s, unfortunately, were at best retired.
Yes.
So
Makes sense.
they were starting from scratch in terms of expertise.
Okay.
And, there's no question they made a lot of mistakes because they didn't, this was their first time and they didn't know that. And this is a problem in the States, especially to some extent here too, where you have these huge gaps between projects.
Yeah.
And, people don't just sit there twiddling their thumbs, waiting 15 years for the next project.
No,
they go and work in different industries, they move elsewhere, whatever, retire.
Yeah.
So, and then you have to start from scratch, figuring out how to do things. And sometimes that works out and sometimes it really doesn't.
Interesting. Vijai here. Sorry to interrupt this podcast. I just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor, the Brampton Honey Badgers. If you're missing basketball and you've been watching the NBA, the CEBL has you covered for the summer. The Brampton Honey Badgers are facing the Niagara River Lions on Sunday, July 27th. This is elite level basketball, and we're so lucky to have the Brampton Honey Badgers in our community. Make sure you catch that game. Now back to the podcast. I have a feeling that there are some parallels with what's going on in Metrolinx a little bit with some of the turnover. Some brain drain. I want to spend some time on France a little bit because I just came from France. I vacationed in Paris just a few weeks ago. I lived briefly in France as well. I noticed there's this sort of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is sort of my hypothesis a little bit. The Marshall Plan countries, let's say, right? Much of Europe, Japan, they are better equipped with public transit infrastructure than the United States and certainly Canada.
Yeah.
And I think part of it might be that, North America had trains, they built railroads. And then we hear about, Eisenhower, the Interstate Highway Act or whatnot. They literally were ripping railroad out of the ground and replacing it with roads for vehicles, right? Is there maybe some truth to the idea that North America went all in on the car, and then Europe and Japan and Asia went all in on public transit infrastructure?
Man, I love this question because this is this is most of my research. And there's no question that yes, that at the highest level that is true.
Yeah.
And there are different reasons for that. One, I'll say it's not that Europe didn't build highways.
Right.
If you go to, their transit networks are way better than ours.
Yeah.
Their highway networks are also generally better than ours too. Germany has incredible highways.
Absolutely.
You can drive sometimes as fast as you want, whatever.
Yeah.
European countries in general have great highways. Japan does too. but people choose to use the train
Right.
because it's actually still better.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that can be true here in Toronto. Lots of people do use transit in Toronto, GTA, and in Vancouver and Montreal as well, because for certain types of trips, it is still better. But if you go back into the history, you're exactly right. What happened, and where Toronto was actually quite interestingly different, was that if you look at the trend, basically after the Second World War, you had a huge industrial buildup during the war,
Yeah.
and that got converted to making stuff for civilians.
Yes.
There was a huge economic boom
Yeah.
over the late 40s and 50s, basically. And cars became accessible to ordinary people
Yes.
in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah.
And because of that, people started using transit less. Another problem was that the transit system, generally Toronto being a bit of an exception, had been very heavily used during the war because you couldn't drive because of rationing. And so people during the war had gotten used to this like super overcrowded streetcars and they were dilapidated because they weren't replacing them.
That's right.
And people were just like, get me off this. Like, I can't wait to buy a car and get off this. Yeah. And so over the course of the 40s and 50s, you saw this big decline. What was really interesting was that in the night, and Toronto was on the exact same trajectory. And what was really interesting is that in the early 60s, in 1963, Toronto made this choice to, well, they did build the subway after the war. That actually didn't move the needle that much. Yeah. But in the 60s, they introduced a whole bunch of new bus service to the new suburbs. Yeah. Something that most cities didn't do. Yeah. And it was like a V. The trajectory was like this. Yes. And so they picked back up the ridership, and it grew basically from the early 60s until the 80s. And that was not the case in the States. Yeah. It just kept declining. And in the 70s, during the energy crisis, when they started putting a lot of federal money into stuff like transit, there was nothing left. Yeah. Like it had, the use of transit had dropped by 95%. And it often didn't serve the parts of the city that were growing fast. Yes. It only served this inner city, which was often losing people. Yeah. And there were other issues too. And so it was kind of too late to save things. Never say never. Like you can still turn things around, but it was much harder. And in many cases, especially in the States, it was private companies that ran the transit system, and people kind of disliked them the way that you dislike a lot of utilities or whatever. The popular perception was, as they started to lose money, they started to cut service, which made them even less attractive, which caused them to lose more money. Some people said, well, we need to subsidize them. And people said, why on earth would I subsidize this company that gives me a terrible service? Yeah. And so that was a big part of the problem in the States. Interesting. And by the time it was taken over by the city or the state, usually in the 60s and the 70s, there really wasn't much left. Right. Whereas in Europe, you didn't have the same sort of privatization. They were generally speaking nationalized earlier. Yes. Yeah. Fair enough. And governments in the post-war years really poured money in a way that they didn't in especially the US and to a lesser extent Canada. Interesting. Okay, interesting. Do you find yourself frustrated at all with how transit is funded in this country and in this province? I mean, honest truth, not really. Okay. So part of the problem when you talk about funding, when you talk about building things, part of the problem is it costs way more to build here than it does in Europe. Yeah, even in expensive parts of Europe, and we can get into that. But you talked about Paris. Paris is building a huge new subway network for the suburbs of Paris. Yes, and they are spending per kilometer. It's never a perfect comparison. Yeah, but I think per kilometer probably a fifth, let's say, as just a ballpark figure of what we spend here. Let's say even a quarter. Yeah. But that's just a huge difference.
Yes,
That's an
absolutely.
enormous amount of money that's
Yeah.
different. And, this is the same problem in the States where often it's even higher.
Yeah.
Americans say, well, we're richer than Europeans. And it's like, yeah, but you're not 4 times, 5 times, 6 times richer
Yeah.
than Europeans.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
you're
yeah,
not. You're
yeah.
maybe 50% richer.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And so that's why the Europeans have so much more, because they can build for less.
Yeah.
And they, but in terms of funding here, I think there are some strengths.
Yeah.
For one thing, governments are spending. Like governments in Ontario, especially the province and the
They're
federal
investing
government
in-
as
yeah.
well, are investing in transit in a way that
Yeah.
we have kind of never seen, and that
Yeah, you're right.
nobody else in North America is building on that scale. Vancouver and Montreal are building some impressive stuff, but and a few American cities are building as well. But like, you compare Toronto to New York, like, not only is Toronto building more, but is spending more than New York City,
Yeah.
like in absolute terms.
Wow. Okay.
So on the construction side, the other thing is, I use these American examples. People often talk about, and partly it's because they have a very different approach to budgeting, where it's much more of a horse trading approach. At our municipal level, it's a bit more like that, but at the federal and the provincial level, the budget is kind of created at a high level.
Yeah.
Cooperation of sort of senior officials on the political and the government side, and then the budget is introduced, and largely the government passes it, or if they don't pass it, then they're out.
Yes.
That's their system. In the U.S., it's like, I want this, let's add this, I want that, and budgeting tends to be much more short term.
Yeah.
So you might get something in the budget this year, but you might not get it in next year.
Yes.
So
yes.
So there's a big push in the U.S. for dedicated funding for that reason, that
Yeah.
transit can be given this specific tax so that they know that they're going to get this tax for the long term. And on paper, it sounds like a good idea. In practice, it can be very dangerous depending on what the tax is. Vancouver has a bit of this model, but not as severely. But Cleveland is a good example. They have a sales tax. So in the U.S., lots of cities have a municipal sales tax. In the metropolitan Cleveland, there's a sales tax, and that goes specifically towards transit.
Okay.
And they've had that since the 70s.
Yeah.
The problem is that the sales tax goes up and down with the economy.
I see.
And
yes.
And so does transit ridership.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
you're also losing in the fare box.
Yeah.
And so after, in the early 80s recession, they had actually improved transit a lot in the 70s, got a lot of riders.
Yeah.
In the 80s, sales tax revenue collapsed.
Yeah.
They slashed the service.
Oh gosh.
And then all those riders went away. And then when they improved it again, it was sort of a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice.
Yeah.
Shame on me kind of thing. Like, people said, I'm not going to take the risk that the bus that I've been taking might not be there, next week.
Totally.
So the same thing happened after 2008. They have a LRT that serves their waterfront.
Okay. Yeah.
That they built with federal money at great cost.
Yeah.
At one point, I remember after 2008, they were operating it for something like 4 hours a day, 2 days a week.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh.
So this is the problem when you have, whereas in Ontario, generally speaking, local operating is funded out of the property tax base, which may be inadequate, may not be. We've gotten pretty far out of the property tax base in a lot of places, way better transit than in most American cities. But the advantage of it is the mentality that we have is a little bit more like, with a highway, right? Like, if gas tax revenue goes down because the economy slows down or whatever, we're not going to close 2 lanes of the 401 and say, sorry, we don't have the money to maintain these 2 lanes. Like, that would just never happen.
Yes.
You budget the amount that's needed to keep the highway open.
Yes.
We have a bit more of that mentality in transit. We're not all the way there, but we have a bit more of the mentality that you put out the service that's required, and you figure out what that's going to cost on the back end, and you will have fluctuations because fare revenues will go up and down with the economy, with lots of other things.
Yes.
And you just have to backfill that as necessary with the revenues that are available.
Yeah. And then intergovernmental transfers and that sort of thing. Administratively, though,
Okay.
I do know you did some work at the TR Bot around um, the TTC acting more as a regional transit body
Mhm.
as opposed to just for the city of Toronto. And it's interesting because I think the more we kind of delve into these transit problems, the more we acknowledge that um, you know folks are largely agnostic about
Yeah.
municipal borders.
Yeah.
You know, if
100%.
if a house is cheaper in Brampton than it is in Etobicoke, let's say, they'll likely move to Brampton and have to utilize a go train.
Mhm.
Um, Now, unfortunately, transit planning is very municipally
You're
centered,
right.
right?
Yeah.
How do we get around that problem? How do we start thinking regionally? Is that the province? I guess that's what Metrolinx is supposed to be thinking
Yeah,
about, but
yeah,
yeah,
you're right. When Metrolinx was created, that was something that people were sort of talking about
yeah,
and how it can resolve that. And I don't think we really have gotten there.
yeah,
There have been improvements.
yeah,
Presto is a big one now that it's
yes,
working.
yes,
There's certain other things that have improved, but you're right. It's a
yeah,
very fragmented transit system, and and that has a lot of different consequences. Like,
mm,
Brampton. Just look at a timetable. This is just reality.
yeah,
You look at the timetable in Brampton, the bus comes, or in Mississauga, the bus comes way more often than it does in a neighborhood that looks exactly the same
yeah,
in Vaughan or
yeah,
Milton or
yeah,
Oakville.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
just a fact,
yes,
and it's because different municipalities have different. Burlington and Oakville, two very similar
yes,
places, very different levels
yeah,
of transit if you
that's
just
right,
look at the schedule.
that's right,
And they, there are a lot of examples like this. And then, of course, Toronto, the big one as well. And I think that the problem, is exactly what you said. Municipal boundaries
mm,
don't actually matter to people.
yeah,
And like when you drive, you barely even notice that you cross from
yeah,
Brampton into Mississauga
no,
or into
exactly,
Toronto or whatever,
yeah,
and nor should you, right?
yeah,
Um, and then go as well, which really could and should be a backbone of like a super subway for the
yeah,
region,
yeah,
not just for trips to Toronto, but like trips within Brampton, within
totally,
Mississauga, or whatever.
totally,
Um, we're not there, partly because it's it's still a pretty disconnected system from local transit. Some places better than others. One fare has obviously helped,
yeah,
but we're still not all the way there.
yeah. Thanks
Uh,
to a lot of your work
Yeah,
for
yeah.
because of that,
Thank you.
yeah,
That was something that we were really committed to, and
yeah,
and with others got some significant headway, and that was
yeah,
a huge win.
yeah,
But there, when you think about solutions, right, to this big picture problem, ultimately there are two
yeah,
families of solutions.
yeah,
One is the whole one giant transit system.
yes,
This has been talked about for a long time.
yeah,
This did happen before here, right? Like TTC used to only serve the old city of Toronto.
yeah,
In the 50s, it was expanded to suddenly serve the entire metropolitan area.
yes,
So it happened before. TransLink 2 in
yeah,
Vancouver serves the whole metropolitan area.
right,
And it does everything from buses to commuter trains to subway, SkyTrain, even actually bridges and some roads.
wow,
But
okay,
look, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But the disadvantages are real. Like, effectively, you'd be planning your local bus route in Burlington or wherever from Queen's Park,
mm,
which means
yeah,
there's going to be a certain distance from
yeah,
local accountability and local knowledge and stuff,
yes,
that
yes,
you do lose that.
fair,
If you go to Germany, they have a different model, which I'm sympathetic to, the Verkehrsverbund, which is kind of like a traffic cooperative. And the idea is this is an organization that it is like a co-op that brings together all the different operators in the region. So that would be like the National Railway equivalent
right,
of Via Rail, the equivalent of GO trains, the subways, the buses, like the local bus services of surrounding towns. all of them are under this one umbrella, and they're funded and they're managed separately by each of these different operators.
Yeah.
But as a rider, everything's on one map.
Yeah.
Everything's on one fare.
Yeah.
All the signage is the same.
Mm-hmm.
The routes are planned and coordinated in a way that they all fit together.
Brilliant.
It's a completely seamless system from the perspective of the rider, even if in the background, like, there's different stuff going on.
Totally.
And that requires a level of cooperation and collaboration within, and a willingness to accept a lack of total control.
Totally.
That we haven't necessarily seen here. I think there is this desire that everything, every municipality and should be able to control their own little, their own sphere and make their own choices. And you'd have to give up some of that, but by doing it in this cooperative way, you'd be still retaining a lot of it.
It's
so,
fascinating.
I think the first step is, I guess, recognizing maybe the status quo doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And then once you go from there, if your two choices are then this one giant system or a more cooperative model, I think then suddenly the cooperative model might look more attractive to people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's fascinating. I guess the counterexample to this is the success story in the GTA is the TTC, essentially the subway, entering Vaughan.
Yeah.
Right. And there are, I believe, two, 407 and Vaughan Metropolitan Station.
Yeah.
In Vaughan. How did that happen? And how can we? I guess I'm a little bit envious of Vaughan in particular, just because, I love Vaughan, I love the York region, but we've talked about the sort of the overinvestment in a bus system that has relatively little ridership, at least compared to
little
Brampton.
service.
Little service, yeah.
It's getting better, but yeah.
And Brampton has far more efficiently spent its transit dollars.
Yeah.
But yet it seems like Vaughan has been rewarded with this this massive sort of piece of infrastructure. And I wonder, what's your assessment of that?
Well, I think partly it's just luck of geography.
Yeah,
like
fair
the
enough.
subway was close.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the history of that specific project, it was, York University is one of the biggest trip generators in the entire region.
Yeah.
Like, it's a huge university and students ride transit disproportionately.
Yeah.
People go to York from all over the GTA.
Yeah.
So, I rode sometimes the buses up to York from Downsview, where they used to end, and it was a nightmare. Like, it was slow. They were so crowded. So York had long wanted a subway extension. That had been planned for a long time, and for good reason. And I think Vaughan was wise enough to piggyback on that and say, look, if you're going to go right to our border,
might as well. Yeah.
Go and then they were bold and they said, look, we're going to build a new kind of downtown type of thing.
All this condo development.
Yeah. And people were skeptical at the time, and I said, I don't know, if there's one thing Vaughan's good at, it's building.
That's right. Yeah.
And sure enough, you go there and it doesn't quite feel like a downtown yet, but there's no question there's a lot of construction there, and there's a lot of development. And I think when you think about a place like Brampton, you have to, Vaughan was wise enough to recognize that this specific project offered them an opportunity, and then they piggybacked on that to meet their own goals. And I think the same is important for Brampton, and it's about figuring out what those projects are and what you want, what would benefit Brampton, and what does Brampton need? And I think Brampton really needs two things, big picture. One is to be able to get around Brampton quicker.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not especially fast to drive around Brampton,
No.
at least at rush hour.
Yeah.
It's not fast on transit either.
Yeah.
At least the buses are coming more frequently than they used to, and more frequently than in a lot of other parts of the GTA. But you're still going to take an hour plus to go
Yeah.
from one end of Brampton to the other.
Yeah.
And never mind if you want to go to a job in Markham or something like
Yeah.
that. So it's about figuring out where people in Brampton or where employers in Brampton want to get people from, where people want to go and where people are coming from or would like to come from. Because that's the thing, you don't just plan for today's demand.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
the old joke is you don't measure how many people are going to use a bridge by the number of people swimming across the river. And it's the same thing with transit or roads or whatever. But induced demand is a thing for transit as much as it is for roads.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, when you look at Brampton, obviously the underground LRT will be an important project, and it does make sense to improve the connections to like Mississauga Square One, places like that. But you also have this GO line that runs right east, kind of diagonally a bit through the full length of the city. And we could do so much more with that than run a train once an hour. Like
Totally.
this could be, because if it's the model that Toronto uses, right? You take the bus to the subway. The subway is fast-ish to go across the city, and then you might take another bus or a streetcar to go to your final destination.
Yeah.
And because the subway is fast, it makes the overall travel time reasonable.
Yeah.
You could do the same thing in Brampton with the GO station. Like, let's say when Heritage Heights is built, if you had a station there, you could take the bus from your house in Heritage Heights to the station. Let's say you work in Bramalea.
Yeah.
You could be in Bramalea in 10 minutes or something. It's incredibly fast.
Yeah.
And then take a bus from there. So now your whole trip might still only be a half an hour, even though you're going across the whole city. So those are the kinds of things that I think could make a huge difference for Brampton. The subway, there's no subway line that's especially close. Yeah. So getting the Toronto subway out, I think, would be more of a challenge. But even then, like, how can you improve links, right?
Yeah.
They used to have the bus on the 407 from Brampton to to York University, actually. Yeah. Could you bring that back to like 407 station? Yeah. If you could get to 407 station in a half an hour from like downtown Brampton or something, that becomes a really useful, other viable route for people going, places in Toronto, including places that the Kitchener line doesn't serve.
Yeah. Do you think there's a psychological barrier for commuters to in utilizing the GO train as an intra-city form of transit? Because I think, I wonder if it's a cost challenge or if it's almost like a branding thing where folks are really just utilizing the GO train to get from city to city, Kitchener to Brampton, Brampton to Toronto. But to your point, once the Heritage Heights GO station is built, or frankly, even taking the Mount Pleasant to Bramalea, I mean, that's a lot faster than driving. But are folks using it like that?
No, not many.
Yeah.
A few.
Yeah.
But no, and I think you're right. Like, I think it's a combination of all three.
Yeah.
Price is a factor, although with one fare, it's not that much more. Like I think Mount Pleasant to Bramalea is still $3.70, which is GO's lowest fare, and then your Brampton Transit fare is free. So you're spending really only a few cents more, really. So it's not a huge price difference. Yeah. But I think that a lot of it is perception. People just don't even think about that as an option. Yeah. But then it's also a frequency question, because if you're walking or driving to the station, you can look at the schedule and say, okay, my GO train leaves at 4:45. Yeah. I'll get there at 4:40 and have time to catch my train, whatever. The problem is when you're taking a bus, the bus is not always right on time, whatever. But right now the trains are running every hour, or sometimes not even that. Yeah. Yeah. So if you miss it, then you're in big trouble. Yeah. And so people generally aren't willing to rely on a connection like that, like that model, unless it's running at least every 15 minutes, probably every 10 minutes. Yes. So I think until GO gets to that point, I think that'll be harder to see. It'd be interesting to see data on, like, Up Express, for example, which really
Yeah.
does run every 15 minutes. Like
Yes.
we know that people are using that for trips within Toronto. Like
Yeah.
people are going from Weston to Bloor or downtown Toronto
Yeah.
on Up Express because they know that it does run all day, every day,
Yeah.
frequently. So yeah, like once that level of service exists in other parts of the network, which is a whole other story.
Yeah.
I think that kind of model is more viable,
Yeah.
and it'll require Brampton Transit and the transit agencies in all the other cities
Yeah.
to think about, and TTC as well, how can we better use the GO network
Yes.
like a subway?
Yeah.
Like the TTC bus network is all oriented to the subway.
Yes.
That's not the case with the GO trains.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how can you use that network a bit better? Maybe it's more stations too.
Yeah.
Like Brampton is a huge city.
Yeah.
3 stations probably not really enough.
Yeah. Totally.
Like especially if you have express and local trains, which GO can do.
Yeah.
Maybe you need a few more Kennedy Road, I don't know, Chinguacousy or
Yes.
something. Like a few more stations would mean that it would be more useful for local trips.
Totally. Totally. I'm surprised that there aren't more high-speed connections, let's say, or LRTs, whatnot, between Mississauga and Toronto. I think that to me is a missed opportunity, and also between Brampton and Mississauga. I mean, I'm thankful that the Hurontario LRT, you know, there is, let's say it's underway, right? The timeline on that, you know, we have to confirm, but it's underway. Do you feel like there are sort of easy wins that we could probably look at? I know we've talked about the Orangeville Brampton Railway, sort of repurposing that. Are there any other wins that you see that are just easy, cost effective?
Well, even just more express buses, for example, could make a big difference. Look, my Waterloo Region had a lot of success with that before they opened the LRT.
Yeah.
Look, I live in downtown Brampton.
Yeah.
And know people in Port Credit.
Yeah.
And we looked at, just go on Google or whatever, find what's the fastest way to get from Brampton, downtown Brampton to Port Credit today. And it's via Union Station in downtown Toronto. That's the fastest way to get there by transit. And it is ridiculous. It's ridiculous on so many levels because now you're overcrowding Union Station, which is already crowded, whatever. Like, so, it would not be hard to find, figure out the major destinations, and maybe it's reasonable. Like buses on Hurontario are well used.
Yes.
Maybe it's reasonable to provide an additional service that takes the 410, 403.
Yes.
And could get to square one in 20 minutes or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. That's what Waterloo Region did. They brought in express buses that used the highway there. Yeah. And they were really fast and they were really popular.
Yeah.
So I know we have that a little bit in Peel Region, but not as much. And the airport too, right? Like the airport express bus is not terribly express.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you were going to go from downtown Brampton to the airport, you're not going to drive along all the Dairy Road or whatever. No. You just take the 410.
Totally.
And so, you can't use that everywhere, and it doesn't make sense for every type of trip. But yeah, if you've got a big destination like Pearson or like Square One, I guess, like it does make some sense. And the 407 too is such an asset for Brampton because it's never congested.
Yep.
So, can you put buses on the 407? GO does it.
Yeah.
And if you do, you could get places incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
If you have places where there's a sufficient concentration of demand.
Yeah.
That it makes sense.
Yeah. No, and we've talked a lot about Pearson being this other, if we were talking about Union Station as this node, Pearson is another one. Yeah. And especially with this Pearson economic zone, you're going to see more and more folks commuting into that area.
Yeah.
And the fact that we don't have reliable transit connectivity west of the airport. We have up, but we have all the infrastructure, maybe with some modifications here and there, to build westward connections or connections west of the airport. It's a real shame that we don't have a train going from Kitchener all the way to the airport. But yeah,
I mean, yeah, like the infrastructure is 99%
yeah,
there. You just need a tiny curve
Yeah.
at where the Up Express track comes in.
yeah,
I mean, you don't necessarily have the track capacity for certain reasons
yeah,
and stuff like that. But it's true. If this were Europe,
yeah,
there's zero question
yes, yeah,
that there would be a train from Kitchener, Guelph, Brampton
yes,
to Pearson.
yeah,
Like, of course,
no-brainer.
And it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And so, generally speaking, when they've built airport, whoops, my phone's going here.
All good.
When they've built airport connections in Europe, usually, not always, but usually they're through routes,
Yeah.
so that it's not just like a destination; it's like a stop on.
Yes.
And it can be a hub too, like Amsterdam, the Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam is like one of the biggest hubs in the Netherlands, and people go there like they're not flying anywhere. It's just like an important hub for buses and trains and
totally
stuff like that.
Totally.
So.
I want to shift gears a little bit to an article you wrote recently in the Globe and Mail. This is more about housing, and we talk a lot. Transit and housing are connected, especially as we talk about transit-oriented communities. You've written about something that I hadn't even remotely considered, which is the lack of standardization, harmonization around elevators, and that being a massive cost driver for housing in North America. Can you tell us a little bit about that article?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this is something that I've come to be interested in, and I've gotten to know, or I've known for a long time, a guy in New York who's been writing about this a lot from an American perspective, but and we co-authored this article together. But I thought this makes even more sense right now for Canada than it does for the U.S. for a lot of different reasons. But basically, the story is that there's a set of standards for elevators, and when you build elevators, in the factory or whatever, design them, they have to meet these standards, and it's for stuff like safety and other things, just like the technology, the way that the components are designed and whatever. It's all standardized so that things can be relatively interchangeable, relatively. There's a set of standards developed in Europe, and that set of standards has been adopted basically everywhere in the world. China being the most important market, but also Latin America, India, Japan, like basically all over the world, this standard for elevators is used. And there's this huge global elevator market with a bunch of companies making elevators and also parts for elevators. Then the flip side is that we have a completely different set of standards in North America. That set of standards is just used effectively by Canada and the U.S. more or less, and
driven by the United States.
Of course, it's driven by the U.S. And we always like to think of the U.S. as this super huge, important, the greatest, biggest market in the world. But in reality, the U.S. market for elevators is small. The U.S. has fewer elevators than Spain.
Wow.
So really, we're this little tiny market, and then there's this huge, big market over here. And surprise, surprise, as anyone knows about, this market is going to have higher prices and less selection than the big, huge market. And so elevators, and let's be frank, this is not unique to elevators. We're locked into unique standards with the U.S. in a whole bunch of different areas. Rail and transit, for one, considering we were just talking about it. But The difference is that elevators are a lot easier to solve this, because it doesn't matter if your elevator in your building is incompatible with my elevator in my building.
Yeah,
It doesn't
yeah,
matter.
that's right.
They don't work together. Like, they don't
That's right.
interact.
That's
There's
right.
no whatever. So
Yeah.
so I could so what we suggested in the article is just, fine, keep the US standards. If people want to buy elevators
Yeah.
according to that standard, absolutely go for it. But also allow people to buy European standard
Yes.
elevators. They're safe too.
Yes.
They work too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what that would mean is you would have this vastly greater pool of options.
Yeah.
If you're a condo developer wanting to
Yeah.
build a building, or a condo board wanting to replace your
Yeah.
elevator. And then it doesn't really matter which one you pick for your
Yes.
specific building. And like, the advantage of being in this bigger market is huge, because it's not just more options in terms of models and
Yeah.
style, like all kinds of stuff. Like, it's also, for example, there's all kinds of what you might call aftermarket parts.
Mm.
So imagine
Oh,
if
yeah.
you bought a car
Fair enough.
and you could just go to the dealership to get it fixed,
Mhm.
and the only person fixing it is the dealership, and the
Yeah.
only parts you could buy
Yeah.
were from the OEM. You're
So-
going to be paying a lot to fix your car.
The Teslas of elevators. Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to be paying a lot. And that's the world we live in today in Canada. If you're in this other standard, there's like 20 companies building other parts, whatever.
Totally.
And so you have way more options.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just about lowering the price. This is one thing. It's not going to solve the housing problem as a silver bullet,
Right.
but to get a building to pencil,
Totally.
every little bit counts.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And especially given that there's so much political will and interest around diversifying away from the U.S. and looking at new markets and new relationships. I mean, this seems like low-hanging fruit in a way. So yeah, no, it's fascinating, and especially as we're building more density, our demand for elevators are only going to increase. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it opens up two really interesting possibilities. One is, Canada's not a big manufacturer in the elevator industry, but part of the reason for that is that we would only be able to produce for this really relatively small market of Canada and the US. If we can produce for the whole global market, maybe Canadian companies can start getting into the industry and even manufacturing. So that's an opportunity. The other one is, there's this, if you go around GTA, anywhere in Canada, there tends to be this divide between everything's either like a single family home or like a townhouse or a like 15 plus 30, 40 story building. Not the only reason, but one of the reasons for that is that elevators are really expensive. So if you're going to need to buy an elevator, you might as well go high.
Yeah.
So if we had cheaper elevators like they have in Europe, and there are other standards differences between us and Europe that are a little bit different, we'd have to think about. But for example, our elevators are just physically way bigger.
Yeah.
And sometimes that makes sense.
Yes.
But if you could have somewhat smaller elevator cabs, you could have more of them in a building, or you could have more of them in, you could have them in smaller buildings and stuff.
Yeah.
The reason we have it is, we like to be able to have a stretcher lie down with a person on either end.
That's fair. Yeah.
Which is good in some ways.
Yes.
But the reality is that it means that a lot of our housing then doesn't have an elevator at all.
No, exactly.
And so, now you're carrying the stretcher down the stairs.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's all a balance. Like,
totally.
Maybe if the stretcher, didn't have a person on either end or sat up or whatever,
totally.
like
diagonal line.
These are things that get debated in these standards, and there's always a cost to some of the choices that you make, and there are unintended consequences.
And I think, this is a good place to wrap up, because I think this also sort of speaks to the North American transit problem in the sense that, in addition to things like consultants and contingencies and all of that, we do spend a lot more than much of the European market on procurement
Yeah.
of hardware.
Oh, 100% we do.
Yeah, and part of it is because of the standardization problem, and sort of we're building Ferraris when we can just build Civics, right? And they're that's totally fine.
It's not even that we're building Ferraris.
Yeah.
It's that we're building a Civic by hand out of like a, like rather than just buying one from the factory.
Fair enough.
Like that's the thing, right? Like in Europe, there are like 5, 6, 7 companies building locomotives, let's say.
Yeah.
For passenger service
Yeah.
in North America, there's usually always only one.
Yeah.
And then they go out of business, and then someone new comes in, and then they go out of business. And so, it's much more of a monopoly. There's less innovation.
Yes.
Et cetera, et cetera. When, that's just the reality of a much smaller market that North America is. Like all of the US has way less passenger rail than like one European country.
Yeah.
Let alone the whole EU, let alone Asia and like all these other places.
Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your time and
Thank you.
your insight and expertise. This is just a cross-section of what we talk about and what will be represented in our white paper, hopefully being published this fall. And some more details are going to be coming about that. But very excited for what we have planned. And if there's anything you want to share with those who are watching, feel free to do that. But I just want to thank you on behalf of the Brampton Board of Trade, and I'm sure you'll be back to discuss more about all of the wonderful collaborations we have in the pipeline.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's great to have an organization pushing for a lot of good things here in this city.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this this special episode of Never Board of Trade. I'm Vijay. I'm your host, and J. Paul will be back for the next episode. We want to thank Mr. Jonathan English for sharing his time, and we want to thank as well our sponsor, the Brampton Honey Badgers, for supporting our podcast. Thank you so much.